The isolated community of Cedar Hollow, nestled deep in the Missouri Ozarks, harbored a secret that would make even the most hardened frontier settlers question everything they believed about human nature. Between March and September of 1834, a respected mother named Prudence Hoffman lost all 3 of her children in what the local magistrate recorded as unfortunate accidents. But what the official records don't reveal is far more disturbing. By the time autumn arrived, 3 more residents of Cedar Hollow would be dead, and Prudence Hoffman would stand accused of murders that may have been acts of desperate justice. The truth about what really happened in those blood-soaked months has been buried in county archives for nearly 2 centuries, hidden beneath layers of shame and conspiracy that reach the highest levels of Missouri's territorial government. The surviving testimonies speak of a woman driven beyond the boundaries of sanity and law, yet they also hint at darker truths about the respectable families who controlled Cedar Hollow's fate. Before we continue with the story of Prudence Hoffman and the horror that consumed Cedar Hollow, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Because this tale of maternal fury and hidden corruption will make you question whether justice and madness can sometimes be the same thing. What the surviving testimonies reveal about that autumn of 1834 would challenge everything the residents of Cedar Hollow thought they knew about the quiet woman who lived at the edge of their community, and about the respected neighbors who had shared their lives for more than a decade. Cedar Hollow sat like a forgotten wound in the Missouri Ozarks, a settlement of barely 40 families carved from the unforgiving wilderness that stretched endlessly in all directions. The year 1834 found Missouri still rough around the edges, a place where territorial law meant little and community justice meant everything. Here, among the limestone bluffs and dense oak forests that rose like ancient sentinels above the narrow valleys, families like the Hoffmans had carved out lives that depended entirely on mutual trust and cooperation for survival. The settlement itself was a testament to frontier determination and ingenuity. A cluster of log cabins and frame houses surrounded the central meeting house, which served as both church and school depending on the day of the week. The building's bell tower could be seen from every corner of the hollow, its bronze bell serving as the community's voice in times of celebration, mourning, or emergency. Gravel paths connected the scattered homesteads, winding between gardens where families grew the vegetables that would sustain them through Missouri's harsh winters, and past small barns where cattle and pigs provided meat and dairy products that made the difference between comfort and starvation. Prudence Hoffman had arrived in Cedar Hollow 7 years earlier with her husband Samuel, a quiet man who worked the small iron ore deposits that dotted the region and provided one of the few sources of hard currency in the settlement's largely barter-based economy. She was 26 then, with dark hair that she wore in the simple braids favored by frontier women, and eyes that neighbors later described as holding depths you couldn't fathom. Her hands bore the calluses and scars of someone accustomed to hard work, but she carried herself with a dignity that suggested education and refinement beyond what most frontier women possessed. Samuel had died of lung fever in the winter of 1831, leaving Prudence to raise their 3 boys alone in a community where a woman's survival often depended on the charity and protection of her neighbors. The boys were her pride and her anchor to hope. Thomas, aged 12, who had inherited his father's steady temperament and careful attention to detail. Benjamin, 9, quieter than his older brother but possessed of an intelligence that impressed even the settlement's most educated residents. And little Isaac, who had just turned 6 and still clung to his mother's skirts with the fierce devotion that only the youngest child knows. The community had rallied around the widow, as was customary in settlements where survival depended on neighbors helping one another through times of crisis. Josiah Grimsby, who owned the largest farm in the hollow and served as the informal leader when disputes needed settling, often sent his teenage sons to help Prudence with heavy work around her small homestead. His assistance came with the expectation of gratitude and deference that characterized most interactions between the settlement's established families and those who depended on their goodwill for survival. Mehitable Stokes, the closest thing Cedar Hollow had to a town matron, made sure Prudence never lacked for preserves or medicine during the harsh winter months when fresh food became scarce and minor illnesses could turn deadly without proper care. The older woman's generosity was legendary throughout the settlement, but it came with a price. She expected to know every detail of her beneficiaries' lives, and her questions often probed into areas that others might consider private family matters. Even Reverend Silas Corwin, whose fire and brimstone sermons could make grown men weep with conviction and whose theological knowledge was respected throughout the Missouri Territory, took special care to visit the Hoffman cabin regularly. He ensured that the boys received proper religious instruction and that their mother maintained the moral standards expected of a Christian widow. His pastoral visits were seen by the community as evidence of his dedication to his flock's spiritual welfare. though some of the questions he asked seemed to focus more on temporal matters than eternal ones. To all appearances, Prudence Hoffman was exactly what a frontier community expected of its women: hardworking, devout, and utterly devoted to her children. She kept an immaculate cabin that served as a model for other homesteaders, grew the finest vegetables in Cedar Hollow using techniques she claimed to have learned from her grandmother, and could stitch wounds or birth babies with equal skill. Her boys were well-mannered and industrious, the kind of children who made other parents nod approvingly and comment on their fine upbringing despite the absence of a father's guiding hand. But beneath this veneer of frontier respectability, tensions simmered in Cedar Hollow like water in a kettle approaching the boiling point. The settlement existed in a precarious balance between civilization and wilderness, where ancient grudges could fester for years, and where a man's word was quite literally his bond. Land disputes that should have been settled by territorial courts were often resolved through community pressure and unofficial justice. Marriage arrangements that appeared amicable on the surface sometimes concealed bitter resentments and unfulfilled obligations. Questions of bloodline and inheritance carried weight that could determine whether a family prospered or perished in the harsh Ozark wilderness. Missouri in 1834 was experiencing growing pains that affected even the most remote communities like Cedar Hollow. The recent Black Hawk War had left many settlers nervous about Indian attacks, though the local tribes had long since been pushed further west by the steady advance of white settlement. More pressing were the economic uncertainties that rippled out from the growing tensions between North and South over slavery and statehood, creating political divisions that could turn neighbors into enemies overnight. The Hoffman cabin sat at the eastern edge of Cedar Hollow, where the cleared fields gave way to dense forest that stretched unbroken toward the Arkansas border. It was a modest structure of hewn logs, chinked with clay and moss, topped by a stone chimney that Samuel had built with his own hands, using limestone quarried from the nearby bluffs. 2 small windows, their glass panes a luxury in frontier Missouri, allowed light into the main room where the family conducted most of their daily activities. The boys slept in a small loft above the main room, accessible by a wooden ladder that Samuel had crafted with the same careful attention to detail he brought to all his work. Behind the cabin, a small barn housed their 2 cows and a handful of chickens, while Prudence's vegetable garden stretched between the house and the tree line in neat rows that demonstrated her skill at coaxing food from the sometimes reluctant Missouri soil. A root cellar dug into the hillside behind the garden stored the preserved foods that would sustain the family through the winter months when fresh produce became impossible to obtain. From her kitchen window, Prudence could see most of Cedar Hollow spread out below, the cluster of cabins around the central meeting house that served as the community's heart, the larger farms that provided most of the settlement's grain and livestock, and the network of paths and cart roads that connected the scattered homesteads like arteries carrying the lifeblood of frontier commerce and communication. It was a view that had once provided comfort, watching her neighbors go about their daily lives with the steady rhythm of frontier existence that marked the passage of seasons and years. The first tragedy struck on a morning in March, when the last of winter's ice was finally yielding to spring's insistent warmth, and the maple trees along the ridge were beginning to show the faint green haze that promised warmer days ahead. Thomas Hoffman had risen early to check the rabbit snares he maintained along the ridge above Cedar Hollow, a responsibility he had taken seriously since his father's death 3 years earlier. At 12, he was already showing the steady, reliable nature that made frontier boys grow into dependable men who could be trusted with tasks that meant the difference between a family's prosperity and starvation. The morning had dawned clear and cold, with a thin layer of frost covering the ground and making every step crunch underfoot like walking on broken glass. Thomas had dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on his wool coat and the sturdy boots his mother had purchased from a traveling merchant the previous autumn. He carried his father's old hunting knife on his belt and a small sack for any rabbits he might find in the snares. Though the winter had been hard and game had grown scarce throughout the Ozarks, Prudence was kneading bread dough at her kitchen table when she heard the commotion, shouts echoing across the hollow, followed by the urgent clanging of the meeting house bell that served as the community's alarm for fires, accidents, or Indian raids. The sound cut through the morning quiet like a blade, sending every resident into the kind of alert panic that frontier life demanded when neighbors faced danger. Through her kitchen window, she could see men running toward the eastern ridge, their movements urgent and purposeful in the way that meant only one thing: someone was hurt, or worse. What they found at the base of Miller's Bluff would haunt Cedar Hollow for years to come, becoming the kind of story that mothers would use to frighten children into obedience, and that men would discuss in lowered voices when they thought women weren't listening. Thomas Hoffman lay broken on the jagged limestone rocks, 60 feet below the narrow game trail he had walked safely hundreds of times before, his young body twisted at angles that spoke of tremendous force and sudden, devastating impact. The boy's neck was bent at an unnatural angle, his skull crushed against the stones that jutted from the cliff face like ancient